Um, Rick, thank you for joining me once again. It's a pleasure, as always, to have you.
Duncan, it's great to be back. Been
Uh,
following your work avidly.
well, as have I, because you recently have published the paperback version, or maybe it hasn't come out yet, but it's coming out this week.
Tomorrow, it's the
Tomorrow.
16th today. The 17th is the official day.
Excellent. Of Reaganland, which, as I understand, is the final book in this series you've written about the conservative revolution in this country. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm thinking about putting together an anthology of my kind of journalism and essays I've been writing since 2003, which I've been writing kind of in dialogue with the history, in a lot of ways kind of provides takes up certain aspects of the story up to the present. But yeah, I don't plan on writing any big history books on that subject in that particular timeline, as the kids put it now.
Yes. That's I would like to persuade you against that because I've really enjoyed this entire series. And one of the things that's interesting about Reaganland, for a book named after Ronald Reagan, it spends a lot of time talking about Jimmy Carter.
Uh,
Um,
well, I've written
why,
about it. I got a piece coming out in the Nation in a couple of weeks, a review of a biography. So
I see.
it'll state you.
Did you just feel like the Reagan years themselves were maybe less important to the story than what
Oh
led
no,
up to them?
absolutely not. No, 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 no. So I'm well, first of all, I conceived of the story way back in the mid 90s when I was thinking about the project as a series that would basically explain the rise of Ronald Reagan. So that was kind of the original conception.
Mm.
And one reason I've stuck to it was, well, 25 years of work is a nice chunk, half a lifetime, literally.
Yeah.
I feel, I feel like I'm kind of earned my spurs to move on to different adventures. But, a really interesting part of this is what it's like writing about stuff you remember,
Yeah.
right? And it's a totally different kind of bag. Uh, and the idea of historical distance is a real thing, right? And so I was 11 when Ronald Reagan was elected. And I mean, Reagan's presidency occupies my adolescence, heading up to going off to college in 1988. And one problem, as you've noticed, I'm sure, that the books get bigger and bigger. um, and once you get into the minutia of everyday life, it's one thing to recover it from documents and
Yeah.
media. It's another to add that, extra matrix of memory. And I think it would be interestingly unmanageable. I mean, I think about, what could I write about from the 80s? I think certain things having to do with policy within the Reagan administration are certainly interesting, but I think a lot of that's been kind of done well. I could definitely point in the direction of good books about the Reagan years. I think that culturally, it's certainly amazingly interesting, but that's where it gets, like, super intimate, um, and I think that um, writing about the kind of stuff I do with politics, kind of in dialogue with culture. I just think that there are better people to do it. You
Hmm.
know, I mean, I just don't think I have the critical distance. I think there are, a lot of interesting subjects. The kind of dialectic within the Reagan administration, the Reagan constituency, the Reagan policy team, Congress, between let's say, the more extreme aspects of the Reagan coalition and the kind of pragmatism of Reagan is super interesting. I get that in kind of essayistic ways and different things. Um, but also, I have other projects in mind. I mean, I want to write, and I've mentioned this a few times in interviews because it's my kind of attempt to ward off people getting all up in my business about what I should do,
Yeah.
maybe. Although I love you guys. I love my readers. is a book about the 1830s, a global history that has to do with how market culture spread across the world. Inspired by a thinker who's kind of my hero named Karl Polanyi, who kind of in a lot of ways was an alternative to Karl Marx. So I just think that would be really fun. I've been saving, kind of articles, research, book titles for that for years. And I think that's my next big kind of 5-year project. I'm ready to pass the torch to a new generation of Americans, forged in 9/11,
Well, it is interesting when you said there about the critical distance, where obviously you're not like a Reagan conservative, but you're writing about this movement. And I will say I have Republican conservative friends who've listened to this show and listened to the previous episode that we had. And we're like, yeah, these lefties are writing about, our beloved figures. Like they're just to attack them.
Did they love Reagan?
Well, yeah, of course, and
I mean, I think actually the image of Reagan has probably evolved in ways that are interesting. But anyway, we can get to that later.
Yes, and I guess what I'm asking is,
I think I'm attacking them?
No, I don't think you're attacking them. I think you're being very fair. But clearly, that's something that I'm sure you gave thought to that. Like, okay, how do I maintain some kind of distance?
Right.
What was that process like?
Well, when it comes to someone like Reagan, I mean, like I say, he was my president growing up, and he was the penumbra, his presidency was, the context for the rest of my life. So in a lot of ways, I'm trying to figure out, what that was about and what he was about. As far as thinking about how to be fair to my subjects, what kind of ideological position I want to land on, I try to think about that as little as possible. I mean, I probably could be accused of lacking a bit of self-awareness if I say that I try to tell the truth as I see it without fear or favor, right? While at the same time making my ideological priors pretty obvious. Certainly anyone can Google me, right? Read the rest of my work. But another thing is, I think that people who decide, who quote unquote, want to write and self-consciously try to write unbiased books and think that's a way to kind of escape ideology, turn out to be obsessed with ideology. And they have to think about ideology all the time, because every time they have to write a sentence, they have to decide whether the sentence is too far left and too far right. And they're always kind of taking that measure. And I think that can get in the way of letting the documents tell the story. And I frankly am in a good place, especially at this late date in my career, that I don't really have to think about too much about what people think about me. If someone accuses me of being biased, I don't care. It's a cliche. If someone says, oh, I get attacked from the left and the right, so I must be doing something right. But I do get attacked from the left and the right. And I think like the worst thing a political writer or thinker can think is to kind of self-consciously think about what their ideological sort of point on a spectrum should be. It's just a giant distraction from the work, I think.
Yeah. Yes. And when you say well documented, that is definitely the apt term, because this all of your books, but this most recent book, Reaganland, is very well documented. And I have a couple questions, or a few questions I want to ask about the book. When I say a lot of this is about Jimmy Carter, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was how you described the election of Jimmy Carter, where his campaign managers were trying to, quote, market sincerity.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit in the context of how it seems like all the elections since then have basically been, I'm the guy who's anti-Washington. Like, no, I'm anti-Washington. It's like everybody just wants to be the outside.
That's part of the story I tell, and that's also told in the previous book, which covers 1973 to 1976, and a little bit more of how he how his team actually put together, the product that was Jimmy Carter, masterfully, both in his part and on his advisor's part. I mean, a friend of mine who writes for the AP tried out an idea that he's kind of like wants to put in his file for his Jimmy Carter obituary that he's writing. I wrote one of those, by the way, in like 2013. People write obituaries in advance, and guys like Carter kind of frustrate that attempt by, living and living and living and living, right? But he said that Jimmy Carter was the 70s singer-songwriter president. And so I don't know how much like, James Taylor or Carole King, but these were guys who, kind of wore flannel shirts, peasant dresses, and completely, tried to strip their music of all pretension and tell about their feelings, and write about existential situations, and moved kind of pop music from this kind of very politicized, grand, you say you want a revolution vibe, to the terrain of emotional intimacy, right? And so that was very much the image that Jimmy Carter put together in 1976. This guy who, farmed the same land his family had been farming since the 18th century, and had pictures and videos of himself, sifting the soil, wearing a flannel suit. In Invisible Bridge, I talk about how they derived the peanut as the key symbol of the campaign. Like if you go on eBay and Google Jimmy Carter peanut, you'll find all kinds of peanut swag, right? Because it kind of suggested humility, and that humility was not their long suit, which is a nicely kind of thoughtful self-worth. That was one of the things. One of the riffs I make in Reaganland is that not only was kind of the marketing of candidates brought to kind of a quantum level of intensity, people talked about it all the time. So they would kind of tell their secrets, so there are these profiles of Jimmy Carter's image makers talking about how they make the image, but they did it well enough that people still kind of maintain this image of him. So, I get a lot at the historically specific matrix about why this seemed so powerful at the time and so important. And the biggest answer is Watergate happened. And this like profound, unprecedented level of disgust with the federal government and all sorts of institutions, and just created this massive market for people who, Jimmy Carter's biggest applause line is, "I'm not a lawyer," right? And so many of the Watergate felons were lawyers. That was one of the things people talked about all the time, right? "I'm not from Washington," huge applause, and the idea that he was, an outsider. And yes, that became a very useful riff, because, it works, and because distrust in institutions has, if anything, intensified in the years to come. Barack Obama did it, even though he was probably our most institutionalist president since, Dwight David Eisenhower, Yeah. What's your reaction to that?
It's very interesting, the fact that, and as you talk about in the book, his campaign managers are not, hiding this stuff. They're on the record explaining to people how we're selling it. And it's curious to me, and I wonder your thoughts on this, where you have a guy like Nixon who, they have the book, The Selling of the President, where they talk about Nixon's campaign and how they really managed the media.
But the selling they did in the Nixon campaign was checkers, and this was chess. It's just like quantum. And of course, candidates have been doing this forever. The Whig candidate was it Buchanan or somebody who's, whose slogan was log cabin and hard cider. He was just a guy from the frontier. So obviously these riffs are definitely, but there's a mass media context, right? And I remember there was this really stuffy conservative, the guy before Goldwater, Robert Taft. And there's this famous picture of him like holding a pheasant that he'd supposedly shot. And he's wearing his like wingtips, unfortunately, So, these are old tricks, there were past masters of it. There was this guy named Pappy McDaniel who became governor of Texas, who, had his own bluegrass band, and, Pappy, and, but the thing that's so interesting about Carter is that it hid kind of all kinds of contradictions, and his manner of being, which was actually very, kind of technocratic, He kind of looked at government like an engineer would look at government. And it also sabotaged him, right? Because like any good coalition politician, he was a master at making everyone think that what he believed in was what they believed in. And part of his mastery of that was basically saying not that much about policy, but lots about feelings, which was, the advice of one of the most famous of these image makers, this guy, Pat Cadell, who died last year, a Trumpy, because he just was so obsessed with the idea that politicians have to, salve people's alienation. So Trump was the guy, right? But this was a terrible, this kind of sabotaged his presidency in many ways, because I have this image in the book. I don't know if you remember it. Gerald Ford's advertising guy, and Gerald Ford's guys did their own business. He had a scatterplot poll that he had printed on clear plastic sheets, and each plastic sheet represented what people's feelings were about Jimmy Carter compared to Gerald Ford. Who was more this, who was more that, who was better on gun control, who was better, and people who had completely contradictory issue positions. As he laid these sheets one on top of the other, the dots kind of kept on clustering around Carter. And so everyone thinks that he's pro-gun control. Everyone thinks he's anti-gun control. Everyone thinks he's pro-abortion. Everyone thinks he's anti-abortion. And so suddenly he's set himself up to disappoint everyone in some way, which of course he did with aplomb by the time
yes.
to try to be reelected.
Have you read the book, The Culture of Narcissism?
Mm-hmm.
Where they talk a lot about how politics, and I think it was written in like the 60s or 50s, and
came out in 1976, and Mosley Carter read it too, and Pat Cadell definitely read it. But yeah. What's your take on it?
Well, it's interesting, and for people who haven't read it, a lot of it is just about how we've become so much more focused on self and authenticity and my feelings, and it seems like that approach is almost antithetical to having a good democratic process. Do you agree with that at all?
Yeah, it's a weird book, and I don't think it made a very specific technical claim about trends in child rearing since the 19th century. Yeah. So in a lot of ways, it was a very weird book to try and draw political lessons from. So in a lot of ways, both Pat Cadell and Jimmy Carter kind of misread it pretty severely. But if you kind of go back to the big story he's telling, and this gets into me as a historian and a scholar of social theory and political theory, his big story was that basically parents were tough on their kids and forced them to fail, and had all kinds of super ego style expectations about what an adult was supposed to be. And that as the 20th century became more individualistic, and by the way, more capitalistic, consumeristic, which is a big part of the story that Jimmy Carter seems to have missed, the idea of raising your child to kind of do his own thing or her own thing, kind of took the fore. And the argument, and it's all based in psychoanalysis, and it's very technical, and this is why it might be right and it might be wrong, and there's really no way of telling, is that in fact that makes people less individualistic, more insecure, more neurotic. And the basic argument is that kids need boundaries, right? And they build that strong core sense of self by trying and failing, and by learning that there are definite rules to how the world works. And there's all this interesting speculation that there's so much kind of helicopter parenting going on. The kids today, are always right, and this is kind of like I think in a lot of ways, the conservative beef about, millennials and all this stuff. And a lot of it is, bullshit, as most generational analysis is. But this idea that kids in the workplace today expect to be kind of catered to, which is definitely something employers tell me in a way previous generations didn't. Yeah. And one of the consequences of this does seem to be, according to some psychological thinkers, is that kids are a lot more neurotic and narcissistic today. And there's a lot more depression and anxiety. Now, these things are very hard to argue historically. For one reason, there are good reasons to be anxious in 2021, with the kind of the existential crisis of the planet and all the rest. But these are very, high-flown abstractions. But I think in the case of Jimmy Carter, he was a guy who was, in fact, very nostalgic for the kind of a hard shell discipline of kind of 19th century or 20th century when he grew up, kind of parenting, in which he, had to like get up at 4 a.m. and, plant the peanuts, and, had a dad who, was not shy about using the strop and was very withdrawing, withholding when it came to things like affection. So I don't know if that's the byway you want to go down, but it's wild stuff and it's super interesting. And I think that a lot of what went on during the period of my book was a kind of reckoning with the culture of the 1960s, in which there was like a lot more individualism.
Yes. Yeah, and I only bring up that book mostly for that reason, because it was this sort of Jimmy Carter does not feel like the kind of guy who would be the representative of that hyper individualistic, narcissistic culture. But I guess in some ways he tapped into it. But one of the things that I want to ask you about that he tapped into, that a guy who you also write about in the book, Orrin Hatch, tapped into.
Yeah. Great. Great.
A guy who became a senator from Utah, right? And believed he could not beat this incumbent until I think it was some like head of the Utah Republican Party told him, you could beat him for the same reason that Carter won, because it's anti-Washington.
Which is, of course, a big part of the conservative ideology, right? That, government is evil, right? So that plays into that too.
Well, and that's what I wanted to ask. Do you think when you quote some Republican pollster campaign person in the book saying, we organize discontent.
Right.
Do you think that there is just this amorphous blob of discontent at this point in American history that you're describing that could have been organized any which way ideologically?
That's a really interesting question. Is there like some genius that could have somehow alighted on the planet in 1976 and figured out a way to, kind of organize this amorphous blob of discontent in a way that was, say, progressive, right? Jimmy Carter thought he was that guy, right? He clearly did not succeed in many ways because he wasn't all that progressive, right? I think that there was such an exhaustion with a lot of what was considered liberalism in the day, because it did seem to have led us, to Vietnam. It seemed to have led us to the stagflation, the economic ordeal of the mid 1970s of inflation and high unemployment. And there really was no, and a lot of that stuff, interestingly, turned out to be kind of epiphenomenal. It just kind of worked itself out. Inflation, happened because these weird, kind of unique things that happened in the Middle East that stopped happening, and then oil prices became, volatile and not astronomical, right? So the old liberal nostrums were going to use the federal treasury to help build the middle class by creating middle class jobs, for example, and social insurance to kind of give people a leg up in hard times. But those things really seem to be kind of discredited, right? So it would have had to have been an extraordinary genius to wrap that all up in a story that also at the same time revivified people's faith in the federal government, which is really kind of the only kind of referee, insurance company, political formation that can, for example, counteract the ravages of the market, right? So that would have been very tricky.
Yes.
I
Well,
would not have envied someone who tried to do that. I mean, Ted Kennedy did try to do it, but it was all kind of based on nostalgia, right?
yeah, and it seems also a part of this anti-Washington, uh, sentiment that wound up uh, the contradictions of Jimmy Carter's campaign. That one of the things that wound up kind of killing him is the fact that it's like, oh, I'm from outside Washington, and I'm going to bring in all these people into my administration who are Washington outsiders, and then it turns out that they all, or a
Had
lot of them, are
Washington
inexperienced.
outsiders.
Yeah,
Yeah. And they had enormous resentment for people in Washington, and people in Washington had enormous resentment for them. So that created an immediate dynamic of dysfunction.
do you think he could have handled that better in terms of?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
I think Barack Obama did a pretty good job of saying, I'm not one of these guys, and yet, hired experts.
Yeah.
Now, for good and ill, right? I mean, experts contain, those establishment experts have certain biases too. I mean, perhaps these are the experts who, kept us in Afghanistan for an extra 12 years, right?
Mhm.
But a lot of this was based in a lot of thin skin among what they called the Georgia Mafia, Jimmy Carter included. A lot of it was exacerbated, increased by the way they just handled their interpersonal relationships. They thought they'd won, being outsiders, so they could govern being outsiders. All kinds of stories about this in the book. And if you want to kind of read a great article about this part of why the Carter administration failed, I write about it. I cite it. A guy named James Fallows, who's still around. He's a writer for the Atlantic Monthly, who was a Carter speechwriter, wrote this amazing book called The Passionless Presidency. Not a book, an article in called The Passionless Presidency that came out just as the Carter administration was kind of losing its popularity in 1979. And he tells extraordinary stories about how the people inside the White House sabotage their prospects because of their contempt for everyone who knew how to do things in Washington.
Yeah, and that contempt for Washington, and not just abstractly on the campaign trail, but personally while you're like in the White House, it seems like, is that part of the reason that even though he had a Democratic Congress to begin with, he was not able to
He held
work with them?
the people in Congress who are Democrats in no less contempt for the rest of the establishment of Washington,
Yeah.
right? And in a lot of ways, I say he was our first "I alone can fix it" president. He thought I'd go alone on the mountaintop, and study a problem, and then I'd come down from the mountaintop and present a solution. And since I won the presidency, the rest of the party should just kind of go along.
Yeah.
And that has never been how things worked, right? That's not how politics works. He could be a brilliant politician at bringing people along to his ideas. In fact, one of the things I really appreciated about one of the most famous foreign policy things he did was bringing the leaders of Egypt and Israel together in a summit and getting them to agree on a peace deal. If he had handled, the Democrats in Congress with the kind of wisdom and patience and sophistication with which he handled these very difficult men, the leaders of Egypt and Israel, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, his presidency would have been very different.
Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, did you feel that throughout the process of writing this book? Like, God, man, if you would just have.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it really just starts right away. And of course, there's lots of books I read about Jimmy Carter, and you just can't avoid it. But it's literally like, like the first week of his presidency, he's like, I've come up with a solution to this problem. What to do about Vietnam, people who were drafted to go to Vietnam and didn't serve, like who went to Canada. And he just kind of announced a solution, which is a profoundly political problem because people have very emotional investments on all sides of this question.
Yeah.
And you're like, Jimmy, maybe you should have discussed it with people first before you just kind of announce it,
Yeah.
again and again and again and again, a day in and day out almost.
Yeah, well, I mean, even at his inauguration, you talk about how there were people who were supposed to be invited who had driven all around the country for Jimmy Carter and didn't get an invite, and then some random guy in their town got an invite.
Yeah.
It just seemed like kind of a mess.
Yeah.
And the I brought this up with a friend of mine who's a psychology grad student, and his take, and I'm curious your take on this. I don't want to go too deep into people's
I love psychologizing about presidents, man. I have no hesitation to do it.
Okay, good.
It feels like, oh, I don't want to psychologize. Bring it on, man.
Good. Okay. Well, um, there's statistically there's an association with liberal types tend to rate higher on levels of openness, and conservatives tend to rate higher on levels
almost
of
definitionally, yes.
Yes. Well, yes. Like orderliness, conscientiousness, those kinds of things. Do you think that part of, I mean, maybe there is some argument to be made that liberal progressive types, by definition, are trying to do new and be open to new ideas. Do you think that there's a potential that those same people are just not as well equipped psychologically to manage the rigors of the White House? Like you mentioned Barack Obama, but he seemed fairly conservative.
No, I don't think that's true. I think that Franklin Roosevelt was both very progressive and very open-minded in the way he lived his life. You know, he was perfectly comfortable surrounding himself with people who had radically different ways of seeing the world than he did. He was perfectly content experimenting in a way, you know, no president ever had before. And he was also a brilliant person at managing personnel, you know, coming up with goals. He, you know, was very good at, you know, basically the poker playing aspects of governance, not showing your cards. And it was said that he had a second class intellect, but a first class temperament. And what that meant was partially from kind of coming from this old money world in which basically all the best qualities of the old order of the American elite kind of concentrated in him, that he had this wonderful self-consciousness, self-confidence, I should say, and didn't really care what people thought about him, and was just a wonderful judge of character. Character, a very old-fashioned word, which basically meant your kind of internal core of your being. That's a big part of like the Philip Glass stuff. No one had character anymore. You know, they were kind of flitting about wherever they saw something attractive, right? So he was brilliant at, you know, getting along with Stalin, getting along with conservatives, getting along with liberals, using the crises of the day as a rhetorical lever to kind of get across reforms that no president had ever been able to get across. I think Kennedy in a lot of ways was similar, although he wasn't quite as progressive. Right. So I don't think that holds as a rule of thumb, fortunately.
Okay.
I think AOC is a great internal compass, for example.
Yes. Yeah. Just, you know, something I wanted to throw out there and get your thoughts.
And being rigid, you know, is a terrible way to govern too, right? Yeah. I mean, you think Ted Cruz would be a good president, right?
Yeah. That's
all kinds of reasons beyond ideology that I think he'd be a terrible president, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Because he doesn't have character, right? He's just, you know, running for the camera and, you know, not really thinking in mature ways about, you know,
running to the camera or running away if he's in Cancun, you know.
Right, exactly. Good time.
Yes. I wanted to make sure I asked you about Reagan himself. One of the things I thought was really interesting about this guy is that, and the last chapter of the book is I think it's called something like Carter is smarter than Reagan, and it's in quotes, and it's superb because it really sums up a lot of liberal culture, and it sums up a lot of our political culture as a whole, because people kept underestimating this guy as just this buffoon, this dumb actor. He was actually a very clever politician.
Very
and I think we might have talked about this a little bit last time, but in the context of this new book, I wanted to ask you, a lot of his political training he got when he was doing these General Electric sort of advertisements, and he would go to the factories. How did that help him sort of tap into what became of the Reagan Republicans, a lot of working class?
That's a very big part of it. So of course, he has this hard scrabble upbringing. He eventually finds his way into radio in the 30s, and then moves to Hollywood and wins a screen quest. And next thing you know, he's an actor. has a relatively successful career until he doesn't, right? And his career was really on the outs when he received this very providential job with General Electric, which was always this company that had kind of marketed itself as more than just a company, this kind of community that embodied values and was on kind of the cutting edge of this kind of media, way of thinking about capitalism, right? And so they had a TV show called General Electric Theater, which was an anthology show, which meant there was basically a different story every week, kind of like the Twilight Zone or something like that. But it was all different kinds of stories, dramas, comedies. And so he was the host, and he was the kind of the anchor that held the thing together. And part of the job was he would go from factory to factory. General Electric had hundreds of them all over the country, manufacturing everything from giant turbines for dams to resistors. And his mentor is a guy, and I write about this more in Invisible Bridge, named Lemuel Boulware, who was a labor relations specialist for GE, who kind of came up with the idea that the way to basically defeat the unions was through kind of mass media techniques, through persuasion, through marketing. And he would do things like do focus groups of the wives of the workers to see what kind of messages would reach them. He would distribute all these kind of literature, to try and turn the workers basically into native conservatives who identified with the company instead with their union. And lo and behold, Reagan suddenly has this guy as a boss. And one of the things he learned from this guy was conservatism, because he had been a conservative. Right. And another thing he learned from him was the idea that it should not be the case that blue-collar workers working for wages should be natural liberals voting for the Democratic Party, supporting the New Deal, that you could turn them into conservatives by using conservative themes, order, basically that the company, basically the people who run companies know best, this kind of industrial aristocracy, and that they have your welfare at heart. And by talking to them and talking to them and talking to them and being a guy who had this extraordinary emotional intelligence and this desperate need, now we get into his psychology, to kind of match his affect to that of his viewers and hearers in order to kind of get that energy back to him. He already, long before he got involved in politics in the early 60s, was magnificent at communicating conservatism to people who probably had only voted for Democrats since Franklin Roosevelt. And he used that very much to his advantage in his first political campaign in 1966, in which he was so underestimated that the guy he was running against for governor, Pat Brown, the governor of California, basically sabotaged the other candidate's campaign because he wanted to run against Reagan because he was so confident that he would lose.
Where have I heard this before?
Again and again. Right? And Reagan was able to get all kinds of working class voters even then by, for example, talking about the kids who were protesting against the Vietnam War at the universities as tying them at the hip to his opponent and the Democratic Party, and claiming that they were privileged snobs who were pissing away an education that you, the working class guy, who's showing up every day with your lunch pail at a factory, have not been able to afford, right? Yeah. So he would, kind of exploit their resentment at, the people Richard Nixon, was very good at exploiting too, and was able to win enormous numbers of working class voters who, by the way, had done so well because of the New Deal and liberalism that there's one point in Nixonland where there was a very small crowd for Pat Brown at a Labor Day picnic, the traditional kind of union Labor Day political meeting, because all these guys were at their vacation cabins.
Yeah.
So it kind of carries through to 1980, in which these people are called, quote unquote, Reagan Democrats.
Right. And a huge part of it that you point out is this, recognizing things like social issues could be a lever to get people in.
Right. Sex is the Achilles heel of the liberal Democrats, right? Yeah. All these changing mores having to do with family and sexuality and gender that were kind of working their way through the institutions of middle-class life during the 70s from the 1960s. Yeah. And all these guys who were these new right organizers who wanted to organize discontent, they all had experienced the Goldwater campaign, in which Goldwater kind of gave conservative ideology to the voters with the bark off, with no trimmings. Basically we should, privatize Social Security. We should end farm subsidies. We should, go toe to toe with the Ruskies until the other guy blinks, right? And this stuff was terrifying, and he lost. So basically, these guys are like, wow, we could seduce voters by actually drilling down on the things that they're actually freaked out about in their everyday lives. Stuff about their daughters getting abortions, or their wives, leaving them, or if you're a wife, these feminists, kind of granting this kind of undoing what seemed like this kind of God-given natural order of family life, and using that to kind of turn people into conservatives, and then kind of making the pivot of saying, wow, have you realized how powerful unions are? Aren't they screwing things screwing things up? And Reagan was a wonderful figurehead for this movement, because he did not scare people like Barry Goldwater did. He had learned to kind of match the affect of his viewers by speaking, by the 1970s and the 60s was a little different, speaking to these kind of aspirational, optimistic tropes about American greatness and that sort of thing.
Well, and one of the things that's interesting about abortion is that even Reagan himself was not anti-abortion until very late, even in his political career.
He kind of figured out his own way of being anti-abortion in the mid-70s. Yeah. And he had signed a very liberal abortion law in 1967, and later said, oh, they tricked me into it. I didn't understand that the loophole was so big. But he's like, he kind of, basically, which he was very good at doing. He was a very guileless guy who could come to kind of the appropriate conclusion in very kind of innocent and non-cynical ways, worked his way to kind of the pro-life position with the kind of aching sincerity that, gave a certain kind of optimism to what could be a very ugly movement. This was a time when people were starting to bomb abortion clinics.
Yeah. And you must have been thinking during the writing of this, the parallels between Reagan and Trump, correct? I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, I can't not, right?
Yeah.
And the parallels and the differences, right? So, Reagan is the guy who, always has a smile on his face, even when he's delivering a dagger thrust. And, he also, really did express his politics in optimistic set of political terms instead of pessimistic terms. He was not the American carnage guy. He was the city on the hill guy.
Yeah.
And he had some very different notions about things like immigration, right? He adored the idea of immigrants coming to America, and actually tried to kind of outflank the Democrats on immigration from the left. He kind of changed his tune in Texas once one of his advisors there said, you can't get away with this. But by the same token, a lot of the same kind of resentments at the snooty, kind of condescending liberals are the same ones that have been weaponized, all through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s into Trump. And so many aspects of Trump's coalition, are the uglier aspects of Reagan's coalition. I mean, you got to remember Jerry Falwell is, at the same time as he's kind of becoming this national figure by backing Reagan, comes out with a pamphlet saying it's going to be really awesome when we have this nuclear war that the Bible predicts we're going to have, because then Jesus will come back, right? I mean, that's some ugly stuff. Jerry Falwell, who says, homosexual will just as soon kill you as look at you, right? Reagan would never say anything like that.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the things that seems like sort of the through line here is that it feels to me like a lot of Republicans in the 70s who had previously been, in favor of abortion rights and then turn against it. It seems like a cynical, just way to capture votes.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it was for a lot of them. It was for George H.W. Bush, almost certainly, right? I mean, I literally have the moment on the campaign trail in New Hampshire where he's like, these abortion people are bird dogging me everywhere. And a famous pundit from the time, Robert Novak's like, well, why don't you change your position? And he just literally just changed.
And it's, but it worked. I mean, it largely worked. Do you have any insight into why it seems like if someone tells you that they're pro-gun, you can kind of figure out the rest of their politics. If someone tells you that
Right.
they're pro-free choice, whatever, you can kind of figure out the rest of their politics.
Right.
Why are these social issues so tightly glued to?
Yeah, it gets down to kind of philosophically or psychologically or characterologically what conservatism is, right? Which is kind of a reverence for hierarchy and authority, right? And constituted authority, right? And even the individualism is based on the idea that the people who own corporations, did so into their individual enterprise and kind of deserve to be the, economic aristocrats. So we shouldn't, mess with their prerogatives too much. And that's the same way of thinking that says the father knows best and he should be running the family, right? That's the same way of thinking that people shouldn't be screwing people they're not married to, because God ordained a certain kind of order for the family, and they all kind of reduce to this kind of great chain of being. Like basically, these people are on the bottom, these people on the top. This is permitted, this is not permitted. It's a right-wing way of thinking, right? And they're organically tied to each other. Even kind of the connection between the family and the economy, right? Are kind of form this organic whole and kind of conservative ideology. There's a picture of the world that conservatives have. It's not a pluralist ideology where you're like, oh, it's great if some people have a traditional nuclear family, and some people have polyamorous families. No, there's one way to do it. The liberal says, I'm not anti traditional family. It's just like, I'm just think that the traditional family is one kind of family among others. That comes out literally in the book, where Jimmy Carter announces very early in his campaign in 1976 that he promises to have a White House conference on the family. And what he means by that is, basically figuring out federal policies that